Hey, church leaders, welcome to the Slingshot Group podcast. I'm your host, Tim Foote, CEO of Slingshot Group, where we help you build remarkable teams and healthy culture through staffing and coaching. And for our conversation today, I'm joined by Steve Cuss. Steve is a pastor, former trauma and hospice chaplain, podcast host, and author of the book, Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs. And if you don't already have that book, do yourself a favor and get it and read it. This conversation was impactful for me as we really dug into self-awareness, how we show up as leaders, and how that interacts and engages on so many different levels with how others on our teams show up. We talked about things like, how does anxiety get in the way of healthy teams? What do you do when an organization is toxic? How do you help move away from that? How do you be part of the solution? Practical things you can do to manage your anxiety in a healthy way, and so much more. So here's our conversation with Steve Cuss. Steve Cuss, great to be talking to you today. How are you, mate?
Doing great, Tim. How are you doing?
Good. It's so nice to be talking to somebody else with an Australian accent.
That's right, as God intended.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know whether you get asked this, but people will often say, "Oh, I know an Australian. Do you know Bruce?" And it's like, "Oh, no, I don't know Bruce." And unfortunately, I didn't know Steve Cuss in Australia, but I certainly know you in America.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we live, 30 minutes apart and almost never see each other. It's a crime.
I know, we need to put that right. Unfortunately, we're not in the same room today, but at least we're on the same podcast. So Thank you so much for being with us to talk about this really, really important topic. But before we jump in, could you just share a snapshot of your ministry story, career story?
Yeah. Came to the States to get trained. I'd only been a Christian a few years. Like a lot of Aussies, I grew up unchurched. So when I came to Bible college, I just had no background at all. So I came to America to get a good, proper theological education, kind of stumbled into hospital chaplaincy by accident, and that became really formative, probably life-changing for me. That's where I was introduced to the theory that I'm now most known for, which is called systems theory. Systems theory is simply learning how to pay attention to the spread of anxiety, first in yourself and then in your people. And then after some seminary, got a master's degree, and then I landed in Las Vegas at Central Christian Church. Got the incredible privilege of working for Gene Apple, who was the lead pastor there, and then Judd Wilhite, two phenomenal guys, both still in the thick of ministry. And then after 4.5 years in Vegas, came to Colorado to help a young church plant. So I was not the planter, but I came in as the second pastor. Great group of people, about 150 people. And, like all church plants, we were portable and young and small and struggling, and I kind of cut my teeth on that. And I led that for 16 years. I'm now on staff at that church. We have a building and we're much more established now. But I now work for our new lead pastor, and I spend my full-time work doing this, talking about leadership anxiety and team health. And it's bewildering. I can't believe I get to do it, Tim, and I love it.
That's great. Married to Lisa and kids?
Yes, probably the more important side. My wife for 26 years as of last week, and then 3 kids. We've got 2 boys, 21 and 18, and a daughter who's 15.
Wonderful.
And it's a good life.
And Lisa's an American, and so you've done really well maintaining your Australian accent and not having a half and half.
Well, it depends on who you ask. Yeah, I definitely sound American to my family.
Well, you won't today because you're talking to me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'll kind of top it up a bit for us and increase the pace of my speech, all of that.
That's the hard thing. We Aussies need to slow down. When I come back from a visit to Australia, I've got to remind myself to slow down. Yeah. It's interesting listening to you tell your story, Steve. You've seen 2 big-time leadership transitions as well, with Gene to Judd. That's a whole other conversation. And then the one that you just walked through personally. Yeah. I'd love to maybe touch on that during this conversation. But also when I was reading and listening to your book, read and listened to the Audible, which I would suggest doing both if anybody's considering it. Steve's book is Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs. And when you were talking about hospital chaplaincy, it reminded me that was actually one of my favorite things in pastoral ministry, was being in the hospital and visiting people at that point of need. And that was obviously where you got so many insights from. But I want to fast forward and ask you, was there a moment in ministry where it all converged, where you suddenly realized, I've got to talk about this, I've got to write about this, I've got to talk more widely about this issue of leadership anxiety?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It was when I was a lead pastor. So like just briefly, my ministry resume, I did a year at a ranch in Montana for kids who got in trouble. So kind of that marginalized kids, teens. I did 4.5 years in Vegas, and my role was crisis intervention. I was in the thick of prison ministry and homeless ministry. And then I did trauma chaplaincy, not in that order. And far and away, the hardest ministry role of my life was suburban lead pastor. And so that was the moment. I was using this theory, kind of systems theory, in the back of my head. And then I got into lead pastoring, and it wasn't working. It was like, man, I'm really anxious. I'm taking everything personally. I'm got performance anxiety around my preaching. And so that was, for me, the turning point. It felt like in lead pastoring, every 4 or 5 years, I'd hit a wall and just throw up my hands at some point and say, I can't keep doing it this way. There has to be a better way. And I think for me, Tim, the gospel I was proclaiming, I wasn't experiencing. That would be it in a nutshell. I was good at proclaiming something that it's not that I didn't believe it. I mean, I've bet my life on it, but I wasn't encountering it. And so I had to dig deeper and figure out what's blocking my ability to experience the peace and freedom and love that I share with others. So that was the moment where I really dug back and reached kind of back into my chaplaincy to get more formal with this theory. And I think what I learned is it's one thing to know something, and it's another to have a rule of life and an actual set of habits and tools. So that's where the book came from, is me crafting these habits and tools and then teaching them to my staff. That's what really helped me integrate it, is being forced to clarify it and teach it and figure out what's working. So we did 8 years of research and development before I wrote the book with my staff and elders and leaders. And we still do it at the church. I start my next class on this thing in like 3 weeks. We cook. I think this is our 11th year of running people through these tools.
So the book basically started as a class, as a strategy for staff health?
Yeah, the last time I had a conversation about this was this morning with the church in Texas, where they run a 9-month course. And I think a lot of churches are doing this now, right, where we're realizing that leadership, culture, these are slow journeys. So we're all trying to figure out some kind of an experience. And I almost didn't write the book because I don't believe you can read your way to change. I think you have to embody. I think you have to talk about it in a safe peer group. So yeah, we do peer groups with a coach, 9 months. We meet every other week for 2 hours. And it's a combination of teaching some tools and then putting people in discussion groups. And then between classes, they have to go out and practice and observe, come back and reflect. It's really what I did as a chaplain in a church setting. In chaplaincy, this whole thing is called clinical pastoral education.
Right.
And the learning model is action, reflection, action. So get out there and do it, and then come in and reflect, and then go out and do it again. So that's what we try to replicate on our staff and for our folks.
Steve, you said the hardest thing you ever did was suburban lead pastoring. Let's double click on that for a minute. To all those team leaders, lead pastors listening right now, is that I know that's a general comment, but I'd love you to talk about that then and that now. Do you think it's changed at all? What's the impact you're seeing? We've been through a crazy cultural moment that has catapulted us probably a decade into the future in a whole bunch of issues. Has it done that when it comes to leadership anxiety?
I'm sorry to say, I do think that what was a very difficult role before COVID has gotten harder. I remember through COVID, I had an angry congregant call me. And I don't remember, Tim, but it had to do with whether we were meeting or not meeting, or wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. It was that kind of deal. But she was basically, at one point, I had to stop her because she really wanted to fight, and I wasn't that interested in fighting. And I just had to remind her that I'm not an epidemiologist. And what I was implying is she's not either, but she was suggesting that she was, that she knew better. And she was, of course, equating epidemiology with our faith, and particularly my faith as the leader. She was accusing or suggesting that I do not have the faith required to lead a church because of whatever decision our church had made on masks. And I just had to say, look, I'm a pastor. I don't know about microbiology. But what I do know is God and theology and our way with Christ. And I think before COVID, it was already a very broad skill set required for a lead pastor. I mean, you think about, public communication and systems management, project management, staff management, and then counseling. What I think about, I know it's the same with worship leaders. It's the same challenge of when you're on a stage. A sermon's not a performance, but it still has performative elements, and adrenaline is involved. And even before COVID, simply preaching a sermon and then coming down front and being emotionally present to people as they need to be prayed for or whatever they're coming down for. When I'm all hopped up with adrenaline and regret, I'm spending half of that time repenting of what I just said on stage. I think COVID just really broadened all of that. And I think our people got less civil and treated us less civilly. And it wasn't like we were being treated very well before COVID. So, yeah, I think everything got more intense.
Steve, at Slingshot, we're all about healthy teams, healthy culture. It's interesting as we protect our own organizational culture and talk to potential team members, I think without fail now, they will ask, what happens when you're serving an organization where the culture is toxic? And I'll always say to them, there's a big difference between dysfunctional and toxicity. And if we didn't work with dysfunctional organizations, we wouldn't work with any organizations because we have dysfunction in our own organization. I think part of that is organizational and self-awareness working together. Talk about how anxiety gets in the way of healthy teams.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, so many ways. Maybe the simplest way is to look at the way teams communicate. So if you have a team leader who's a rigid communicator, which is how I would describe myself, when I speak, I sound more definitive than I really feel. So my head is fluid, but what comes out my mouth to my people sounds very concrete and definitive. That can shut people down. My confidence can close a conversation unintentionally. Then if you think of a rapid or a deliberative process at the speed at which your brain works, which of course has nothing to do with intelligence, but my brain moves pretty quickly. If I've got a fluid communicator on my team who's a deliberative thinker, if I'm not careful, I can just run roughshod over that person in the very best well-meaning effort to go on vision or whatever we're doing. I know for me, I often feel like there's too much on my plate. So I'm often trying to get it off my plate to free up brain space. But, a team member could say, well, that's a toxic situation. But what's really going on is the team's just never had a frank conversation about the way we're all wired. And in my case, I remember I was several years in where I had to learn, oh, man, the way I communicate sets culture. So a couple of practical things I did is I started putting the decision into the next staff meeting or the one after. And I would just announce up front, I'd say, look, here's what we have to figure out, but we're not going to figure it out for 2 more meetings. And maybe you don't know what you think until Friday. But we need to hear from you, but we don't have to hear from you today. And that just relieves pressure. So it's on a simple, if you're talking about toxicity, dysfunction, just on the way we relate, our capacity to give everyone a fair shot at sharing what they think.
Right.
And then for the leader to learn to not be threatened by skepticism. Another simple thing is sometimes if I'm a raging optimist, which means on the one hand, makes me a great leader, but also means I can get us into trouble quicker than most people can. So if my pessimists they're sitting there and they're saying, I don't think this guy's thought this through very much. If they start chipping away at my idea in public, I get threatened rather than realizing that this is a gift. And I might blame them for not having faith, for example. I've seen this happen a lot, where the leader will say, well, you just don't have faith, or you need to, get on board. But what's really going on is this person is genuinely trying to protect the organization against the leader. So in systems theory, the counterintuitive move is to move toward them and actually invite more skepticism, because the more you try to convince them with optimism, the more entrenched they feel they need to be in their pessimism. So these would just be just as you look at simply communication theory, this would be one simple way that I run into, particularly with lead pastors. I think we're prone to this, where we can slow down a bit, learn to listen to more diverse voices without feeling threatened. That's I guess something I'm looking at right now with when you say dysfunction. When it gets into toxicity, and then I guess the next extreme might be like narcissism. What I'm looking for there is, are people interested in the way their behavior impacts other people? So, for example, when I learn that I'm a rigid communicator, it tends to shut people down. Now I've got a decision to make. I've almost got like a Romans chapter 6 fork in the road. Right. What path am I going to walk down? And I've seen some leaders say, well, this is just the way it is. But really, a healthy leader, I think, wants to realize, I don't want to shut anyone down. I actually want to communicate in a way that invites people. So I'm going to actually modify the way I am to increase the chances of other people sharing. So toxicity, I'm always looking for, do you care about how other people experience you? Or are you saying, well, you just have to deal with that? So in the general rule of anxiety, what you're trying to figure out is who's spreading the anxiety and who's catching the anxiety. And if the person spreading it doesn't care, that's usually the sign that they're toxic. If the person who's spreading it doesn't know, that might be the sign that they've got some narcissism. Yeah. And those are just be a few ways you could look at it.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful for approaching a team with team awareness and your leadership with self-awareness. It's interesting, Steve, reading and listening to the book has not only made me more aware as a team leader, but also as a parent. Parenting adolescents, oh my goodness. I mean, you and I both know the challenges that come with that, but leaning into or moving towards their behavior really shifts the way that I've approached certain parenting things too. So there's an added bonus for those who haven't read or listened to the book yet. You said about announcing that a decision wasn't going to be made until the next meeting or the meeting after. I want to dig into the whole idea of announcing. How is announcing yourself as a leader important, and even announcing how you're experiencing the team important? Sometimes we'll talk about it in our coaching work, and all our listeners would be familiar with this, sharing the last 10 or the last 5% of how you're seeing a situation. Talk about how that plays out in managing leadership anxiety in a team environment, team setting.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the general managing leadership anxiety idea is that you trust everybody to manage themselves.
Right.
But I think most leaders tend to overfunction, and we try to manage each other. We try to kind of manipulate, but we also try to manage each other's experience of each other. So I've found myself doing this as well. So like if I'm a raging optimist and I've got 100 ideas any given day, on the one hand, that makes me a very nimble leader, good entrepreneurial, don't get stuck. On the other hand, that can wear out my people. It can be hard for them to figure out when I'm taking something seriously and when I'm not. And so having a frank conversation about that, and then maybe a team, I've had team members that just are those yeah, but people. They're just, their first response is yeah, but. And I think what's interesting is trusting that they can manage themselves with that. And the best way I know is to have a frank conversation. Like, oh, look, I'm a raging optimist, and this is the positive side of that, and here's the impact of it. let's talk about your tendency to always find the negative. What's your take on the positive and negative of that? And get them to actually say it. And then most people can manage themselves in a meeting if you've talked about the way you're all wired first. But if you don't, you end up just getting frustrated with each other and really coming at each other in aggressive or passive-aggressive ways. And inevitably, someone's going to just not just stop giving the last 10%, but they'll actually just start having their own meetings after the meetings and creating so much more work for you as a leader. I also think the longer we're in leadership, the more we're learning about power dynamics. And I confess I've been late to this. I run everyone's paycheck. I open the Bible for people, and I've been around 16 years. That's a lot of power. So what's it like for me to show up to a meeting and not give my opinion? That was a good experience for me the year we transitioned leadership. I realized I had 9 months to stop giving my thoughts because very, very soon I wouldn't be around to give them anyway. And I was quite embarrassed how hard that was for me to not speak up. It felt wrong to sit in a meeting and not say what I think because I was the most experienced person on the team. I'd been there the longest and shaped the culture. So learning to not speak is unnatural for a leader, but really helpful. And it helps you see some things that maybe you didn't see before.
It's interesting, Steve, because we talk with our associates at Slingshot a lot about what we do and what we don't speak into when we're working with an organization. As I'm listening to you, I'm relearning or realizing the importance of self-awareness to managing your own leadership anxiety and the team members taking responsibility for managing their own. We obviously do a lot of hiring, a lot of building teams.
Right.
And you describe yourself as an optimist. You talked about the yes, but person. We talk about disruptors. So often people will remove others from the team that are not like them or that make them feel uncomfortable. But how powerful to manage to take responsibility for managing your own anxiety as a team and to have all those different personalities at the table. Talk about how important it is to have the different personalities at the table in a team setting.
I mean, I really do think it is the body of Christ as it relates to a staff structure. I think every part is essential. And I think it's important, regardless of hierarchy, to realize in biblical leadership, no one role is more important than the other. I also think it's important to note, because I can come across making this sound much easier than it is, there are but people that when you show them that and they're aware of it, they don't work on it and they do infect the room with negativity. Like, that's true too. And so with those folks, I've had a couple where I have removed them after multiple conversations, because it's one thing for them to help us by making sure we've thought through everything. It's another thing that they're just plain cynical, for example. So I've kind of taken a tangent here, Tim, but like as I'm thinking through, I know I have a tendency to make it sound like, oh yeah, I just show up and things get healthy. But like I've had conversations with people where I say, look, there's no room for cynicism and there's no room for sarcasm. There's always room for well thought out concern, because there's things I haven't thought about, but I'm measuring those because cynicism can breed anxiety as well. But boy, I think it's so important to have the deliberators, to have the fluid thinkers, the ones that wake up 3 days after the meeting and now they know what they think because they just do not feel ready or comfortable to share their opinion. So something a leader can do, if you can learn to shut up, which is very hard for a leader, just notice the patterns, like who is always the first to speak up in your meetings. It's almost always the same person. Who never speaks up unless they're called on. It's almost always the same people. And just start asking yourself, am I okay with this predictable pattern? And if someone like me trained in systems theory, I can come into your staff and it takes less than 5 minutes to see the predictable recurring relational patterns in your team. And you already know them, you just haven't maybe brought it to the surface and had a frank conversation, particularly in church, because in church that feels aggressive. And there's this weird thing in church where we believe we're supposed to be nice, like Jesus died so we could be nicer. I don't think it's nice at all to talk about people behind their back instead of to their face. So So just learning to notice those patterns in your team and get curious about why isn't Joseph speaking up? So sometimes I do consults. I did a consult in England where actually this guy's name actually was Joseph, and he never spoke up. And I stopped the group and I said, why is it, Joseph, that you never speak up? And why is it that the rest of you let him get away with it? And the answer was, well, because we're English. We just ignore that. But Joseph was brave enough to say, well, it's because English is my second language. And these guys move so quickly, by the time I'm ready to share, they've moved on. And they were blown away that they just were not aware that they were running faster than his mind could keep up with. And so just being aware of those dynamics is such a simple thing that anyone can do. And you could really find some gold in your folks if you slow down a bit and figure out what's blocking them and when you're blocking them.
That's huge.
Yeah, that's a big piece.
As we were preparing for this conversation, Steve, you talked about the challenge of the long-form nature of this topic or subject versus the short-form nature of a 30-minute discussion. So I'm going to ask you to do the impossible and give us a snapshot right now of what we need to, the top things we need to know about how we show up. You've used that term multiple times. Talk a little bit about us being aware of how we show up in a team environment.
Great. Yeah. So the theory is that every one of us have between 12 and 50 triggers that get us reactive when we don't get what we want. So in my life, I want to be understood. I want to be respected. I want to be liked. I actually want to be adored. That's my dream, is that everyone who meets me at least likes me, but ideally they adore me. I want to be seen as the smartest guy in the room. These would just be a handful of things that I want. And if I'm tired, if I'm feeling threatened, attacked, run down, these wants take over my best self. I'm no longer my true self as God designed me. I'm now operating out of these what we call false needs. So that's what I call anxiety, or that's what systems theory calls anxiety. So going into any meeting knowing what you think you need that you don't really need is really powerful. So when I walk into a monthly elders meeting, I know that I need to have the answer. This is a false need of mine. If you ask me a question, I must know the answer. If I don't know the answer, that clearly means I'm stupid and everyone knows I'm stupid. I mean, obviously I don't think it that clearly, but once you dial in, it's pretty diabolical what is going on underneath your core beliefs. So when I walk into that elders meeting, it's really freeing to realize I have this tendency. So I'm actually going to practice tonight not knowing to see what it's like. So that kind of self-awareness is really powerful. And then the second thing a leader can do is once you've noticed your anxiety, if you can just pay attention to when it's spreading in a group. Because this reactivity, this kind of anxiety is the only form of anxiety that's contagious. So let's talk about grief. Grief is not contagious. If you've lost a loved one and let's say you're crying uncontrollably, that's not contagious. But if I'm with you and I walk away anxious, it's not because I caught your grief. It's because of my chronic anxiety, my false need. I went in believing that my job was to comfort you or make you better or say something helpful. And because I wasn't able to do that, I walked away anxious. So anxiety, chronic anxiety is contagious. So the other thing a leader can do is notice it spreading in a group and who's catching it, who's generating it. In most teams, it's the minority that generate it and the majority that carry it. So we're getting a little deep here, but this is why people leave jobs, is not because of the job description, but because of the relational tension.
Right.
And they either don't want to do their own work or they realize that I can't change another person and can't work for them anymore. It's one of those two. So those would just be a couple of things, is learn to notice your triggers, learn to notice when you're being reactive. And then I think, Tim, the third tool is if you can actually vulnerably give your triggers to your team, they can help you notice when you're triggered. It's very humbling. I've done this with my children, and then I've done this with my staff. And so my team are the predominant feedback loop for my anxiety. It's my team that typically would come to me and say, Steve, by the way, Tim, this is happening after I've written the book and I'm the so-called expert. Right. This is not like, back in the days when I used to be anxious. My team are the ones coming to me saying, Steve, I think you're anxious right now. I think you're not aware of how reactive you are. What's going on?
Did you wish they hadn't read the book?
It's been such a gift. It's been such a gift to be an exactly human-sized leader, and then to set that expectation for my team, yes. And then, of course, set that for them where that's what I expect out of them. But when we help each other that way, it's real. That's where health really begins.
We talk a lot about tension and the necessity of tension, because it's what propels ministry forward. Yeah. But keeping it healthy and knowing when it's crossing the line to unhealthy. A lot during the last couple of years of the pandemic, we've been talking about being a non-anxious presence. And I know you talk a lot about that, Steve. Give us just a couple of nuggets or handles on how to be a non-anxious presence.
Yeah, it's such a great question. It's such an important question. Non-anxious presence is a clinical term from systems theory, and I've actually changed it now to connected presence because it gives the impression that you're not anxious, like Yoda or the Dalai freaking Lama, Of course, the Dalai Lama's not anxious. He doesn't have kids. He's got a fairly straightforward life, really. But connected presence, what you're trying to do is you're trying to stop your anxiety from spilling into other people. You're trying to stop them from having to manage you. The second thing is you're trying to stop catching their reactivity when they can't manage themselves. So that's what we're chatting about with adolescents. That's the real skill. When you're adolescents on the roller coaster, being able to stay on the platform, wave them goodbye, know that they're going to come back. How was the ride? Rather than getting on the roller coaster with them and up and down. And so it's managing your anxiety from spilling into others, keeping from catching others' anxiety. And then the third and difficult thing is really staying in a posture where you're listening to learn. That's the connected piece. If I can just keep listening to learn from you rather than listening to defend or fix. And then the fourth thing is being very clear on your values. Who am I? What has God called me to do? So like this lady that called and wanted me to be an epidemiologist and was accusing me of not having faith. Rather than fight, I went through those steps. Okay, look, I'm angry at her. I'm a human being. She really made me mad, but I'm going to manage that. The second step, not catching hers. I do not need her to treat me a certain way for me to be okay. That's the power in systems theory. So she's mistreating me horribly, but that's okay. I can manage myself. Okay, step 3, I'm going to really listen to what she's saying. Okay, step 4, who am I? What has God called our church to do? And that's what I speak to her. And I say, look, I understand you're angry. You want to fight. I'm not interested in fighting. Here's why we've made this decision. Here's the thinking behind it. Here's what we're doing. Here's what the gospel calls us to. You don't have to agree. You don't even have to like it, but that's what we've done. Now I've put the anxiety back on her, and she has to decide, what am I going to do with my rant? And the next time she sees me in the hallway, is she going to hide or come up or, But what I used to do is catch the anxiety, replay the phone conversation. Maybe what I would do is have an anger fantasy about her in my head, like, but no, it's just now like defining, here's what we're about. In marriage counseling, they teach using I statements. It's that same kind of idea. And it really can diffuse a lot of anxiety when you do those 4 steps. But it's hard. It's hard work for sure.
It's hard, but such important work and so helpful, Steve. As we close, what are some practical things leaders can do to create a safe place for someone on their team to manage their anxiety in a healthy way?
Yeah, the step number 1, and it is brave, is you can sit down with your people and you can just say, how do you experience me when I'm not well? Just ask them that question. And then if they're willing, you can share with them, here's how I experience you when you're not well. And then you can ask, would would you like to enter a covenant together where we help each other? So this is what I love about this work. It's not about being perfect, or it's not about no longer being anxious. That's what I was saying before. Like, I'm still an anxious person. I still overreact and get all petty. But the simple idea that we can help each other and notice when each other isn't well, that's where that would be the most practical thing is, how do you experience me? Would you like to know how I experience you? And then third, would you like us to help each other in this? Some staff cultures, and I've seen these in churches, they enjoy sarcasm and ribbing. And I enjoy absurdity, and I think there should be lots of humor on church staff. But the problem is, if you're holding each other's vulnerability, you cannot use that to mock people. That's not going to work. And I've seen that happen, Tim. So that's why I said that. The final step would be, most leaders simply do not believe in taking care of themselves. We're mission focused, we're others focused. And so I think what COVID did is it didn't create the condition of our soul, it just exposed it. And I think we all went into COVID running on fumes, believing that we could just take one more hill. And so that's the question now in this COVID hangover is, are we finally going to actually let God take care of us the way we say God takes care of others? And that would be my final counsel to any leader, is to create a culture where people can experience the love of God congruently with the way they teach it.
Yeah. We often say that we believe part of the reason that internal organizational culture gets unhealthy these days is we're so focused on the people we're serving that we so easily neglect the people we're serving with. And that's why I love the work that you're doing, Steve. Is there a line, let us into Steve Cuss's head for a moment. When you're on a tired day, or you're feeling weary, or you're not in the healthiest place, and you see yourself leading a situation where you're grabbing for that thing that you know you need but you don't need, what's the line?
Yeah.
What's the self-talk you give to yourself?
Yeah, the prayer I pray, there's two prayers. One is, Jesus died to free me from blank. So it's, Jesus died so I don't have to impress people anymore. I don't have to preach gold standard sermons anymore, whatever that is. Jesus died to free me from blank anymore, or needing blank. And the other one that's really helped me with my inner critic is, what if I was at least as blank to myself as God is? I think the problem with leaders is the story we tell ourselves trumps the story of God. That's, I think, it. So I'm not very forgiving of myself. I'm pretty harsh on myself, and God is more forgiving and kind than I am. But it's pretty arrogant. And so here we have God as our sovereign king, and yet our inner critic is often getting the last word. We're not giving God the last word. So that to me is a practical way, is to make sure that I'm letting God's gospel speak louder or last over the condemnation in my own head about my leadership.
That's great, Steve. Often I have to remind myself that God doesn't need me.
Right.
Yeah, because sometimes I like to fix things and like to be needed and necessary, and he doesn't need me.
Right, feels good.
Steve, this has been great. As we wrap, is there anything else you would like to encourage leaders with who are listening today? You're talking to a lot of leaders like we are. What's the one thing you think they need to hear today?
Yeah, I would just say that you're worth it as a leader. Your soul is worth it, your well-being. God is not calling you to run on fumes. God really is calling you to serve out of the overflow. The early church father Bernard of Clairvaux talked about don't be more generous than God, he says. I think that's fascinating. And he talks about operating out of a reservoir, not a pipe, because a reservoir is always operating out of plenty. And then the second thing I think I would say to leaders is, this kind of work, you cannot read and listen to change. You have to find some kind of rule of life. Some kind of habits and practices and group where you can try these things and talk about them and get it out of your head and into community. So that would be particularly for leaders that might be feeling lonely. Maybe this is the time to find a couple of other pastors where you can sit down, grab a lunch, and have these conversations. I don't find this work to be very technical or difficult. It's just about intentionality and time. So that would be my final word, I think.
Steve, I'm so glad you're doing this work. The book, Managing Leadership Anxiety, is transformational. The work that you are doing is transforming teams. Thank you for doing it, and thank you for having this conversation today.
Yeah, Tim, great to be with you today. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope this conversation will help you manage the anxiety that we actually all deal with and show up in a healthy way as you build your team. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and share it with another leader. Thanks again, and until next time, stay curious and reach for the remarkable.